This is Phil at Magic Jesus, and this is Caesar's Messiah Part 2 of the 2023 interview series with author Joseph Atwill. Let's welcome Joseph Atwill.
Hi, Philip. Thanks for having me.
All right. How are you today, sir?
I'm just fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Myself also. This has been a great adventure for me, getting back into your book and trying to wrestle with it. It's a tricky book in that it's easy to lose track of the Jesuses and the Simons, and it's hard to keep all of that straight.
I'll say.
Okay, yeah. And yet this book has just repeated nuggets of great information over and over again. And so I've got to give you a lot of credit for being able to interpret this stuff.
Well, thank you. It's sort of like layers of an onion. I mean, the core, which is just the sequential parallelism between Jesus's adult ministry and the Titus Flavius's war campaign. I think that is straightforward, easy to follow, and people get a lot of value out of it. But when you get into some of the more complicated literary connections that the Romans are making, at some point it is really difficult to follow. And I think they're kind of basically showing off how tricky and complex they can make allegory and literary connections. So it doesn't surprise me that some of the analysis at the far end is hard to follow. The criticism of Caesar's Messiah, I think, makes an error when it goes to the extreme points of connection and then tries to just point out that these could be far-fetched without really starting criticism at the core, which is just that the ministry of Jesus is dependent on the military campaign of Titus Flavius.
Right. And I find that military aspect very valuable to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Aren't the Gospels themselves reports from the battlefield of good news?
That's one of the common uses of the word. It's there's more than one in historical literature use of the term from this era, but the very, I think, most common term is that it's good news of military victory, and particularly in the context of the language of the imperial court. So the imperial court had quite a few expressions of Caesar divinity, which are very unusual. It's an unusual set of words and of interpretations, and somehow a great many of these end up in the Gospels, including the term gospel. So I think this is a mystery that is explained by Caesar's Messiah. It's the reason these technical terms from the imperial cult end up in the Gospels is because the writers of the imperial cult's divinity literature relating to the Caesars are the ones who produce the Gospels.
Okay. Before we started really diving into your work and peeling back the onion, I had some more some kind of general questions I'd like to ask you about a few Bible characters, if I may.
Sure.
And I think these are easy questions. First question, how do you see the relationship between Yahweh and Satan? Are they frenemies?
Satan in the Old Testament is frenemy. But as you go into the New Testament, they're basically sort of transmogrifying the term to just be uh, possessed of evil. The 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 satanic possession, particularly at the beginning of Jesus's ministry when he's wandering around the Sea of Galilee, this is relating to the force that has possessed the rebels of against the Roman Empire. So the authors of the Gospels are actually making a kind of witty point. They're saying, that there's been a possession of the rebels, and this is, we're describing it as a satanic possession, Jesus is there to exorcise the demons, from um, these satanically possessed individuals. And this is just a typologic representation of the Roman military campaign that is going to find a way to pacify the satanically possessed rebels. In Caesar's Messiah, uh, there's this long standing, we discussed it, I believe, last time we spoke, allegory that courses all the way through the Gospels and Josephus. It's just immense. And it ends up with the three Flavian Caesars together in a room, and they have a Jewish messianic rebel in their possession, and they use a root to exorcise the demon from this individual. And this is, clearly representing the same phenomena that's occurring in the Gospels. The root is just the vegetative messianic
Branch or
language. In the Old Testament, we have the root of Jesse and the branch of David, and so they've essentially extended this vegetative metaphor, and so now they're using it in a very clear way to show what exactly they had in mind for their character Jesus Christ, that he would be a kind of a root that would pacify the satanically possessed rebels.
right. And the fact that you probably can't really draw a mandrake root through somebody's nose doesn't seem to bother the author,
Yeah, it suggests we're looking at metaphorical literature. I mean, I've actually read a few interpretations of that from Josephine scholars, and it's just sort of pitiful. They try to relate this into actual history somehow, and it's ridiculous. It's
it's
obvious.
it's it's more like slapstick comedy, is what it
It's what it
says.
is. No, no, that is such an astute comment. It is slapstick comedy, and this is the one of the hardest things. The two really difficult things to understand about the Gospels. One is a lot of it is slapstick comedy. This just it's just not somehow in the thought world of many of the New Testament scholars. They cannot see it, but it is there. And then the other thing is that a lot of the metaphors are vicious, that they are really violent and angry, and are so they seem to be, as Jesus speaks the literal words, there's some kind of pacific or beneficial aspect to what he's talking about. But if you look at the meaning, the deeper meaning in the text, it's very, very violent. So those two kind of interpretive framework principles are not in New Testament scholarship, and it's one of the reasons they have a hard time understanding the Gospels in general.
Was going to also ask you, could Satan be seen as a vizier or overseer for Yahweh?
Good question. I've read interpretations that suggest that. I'm just going to keep an open mind and wait for some more clarification on it.
Okay, well, what about Satan Peter?
Yeah, I mean,
By
there,
which I mean Saint Peter being called Satan by
yeah, yeah,
Jesus right after he has commanded him to become the vizier or overseer of the entire church.
yeah. I mean, that interpretation is totally coherent.
But
Um,
now, of course, if he's standing in the way, I believe he is arguing against Jesus and saying, don't go to Jerusalem. And so he's a stumbling block or an adversary, which Hasatan traditionally was. I think.
sure, and then think of how these kind of metaphors are being developed. At that point in the military campaign, Simon is an impediment against Titus going to Jerusalem. I mean, he's actually attacking the Roman legions at this point. So when you get to the Gospels and they're metaphorically representing the military campaign, you have them constructing, the character Simon as representing Satan. There's no question. But okay, so one thing to remember is that the character Simon is very, very complicated in the Gospels, very difficult to understand, even as a typologic character, because If you look at the conclusion of the Gospels, you have a very obvious parallel between the end of the military campaign and the conclusion of Jesus's ministry. Jesus says to Simon, you're going to go to Rome, you're going to be bound, taken where you don't want to go, and you're going to be executed. And then he says to John, you're not going to have that fate, basically. Now, this is a parallel to what occurs at the end of the Roman Jewish War, where they capture the Messianic leaders, Simon and John. They fulfill Simon's fate, and then John is given life imprisonment. So you have a very, very obvious parallel between the conclusions. But look at what they're doing. They're taking the history of the Messianic rebel Simon, and they are morphing it into the Christian gospel character Simon. So you have two sides now to this individual. You have a historical side, which I think Josephus is more or less presenting, though you can't really trust his history, but nevertheless, it's presented as a historical character. But that character is simply the basis for the Simon character in the Gospels. So that now what they've done is they have morphed Christianity, the Roman religion, onto. They have basically grafted it onto the religion, and they are using the history of the historical character as part of what they're linking to with the character that they have in the Gospels. So you just have to be really alert when you're trying to understand the character in the Gospels, because he's both a fictional religious character and he's also representing a historical individual.
Okay, and I had another one, a couple about Saint Paul. Is Saint Paul celibate? Do you think so?
Sure, he's been castrated. Um, they have a
Really?
Yeah, they have. I mean, Paul is an example of extremely vicious and sophomoric Roman humor. In Acts, you have the character, his name is at that point is Saul, and they have a passage where they say that a group gathers around him. They have a Herodian in their midst for some reason, and they sever him for the Lord. This is a very particular Greek word. It's cutting, severing. They sever him for the Lord. And then the next time the character is described, just a few lines later, they have Saul, now called Paul. So he's changed from Saul, he is severed, and then he is called Paul. Now, Paul means tiny. So what they've done is when they laid their hands on him, they castrated him. This is, you have to read in between the lines a little bit, but now the character is Paul, and Paul is tiny because his penis has been severed.
Okay, what do you think of Saint Augustine's assertion that the thorn in Paul's side is his attraction to other males?
I think when you get Well, first of all, I think Augustine is, more propaganda. He's a sophist. He comes from an imperial or patrician family. I don't take him seriously.
Is he an allegorist? Or is that
Yeah,
what you're
I
saying?
mean, he's an allegorist, but I also think, I mean, look, you've got the Gospels. They roll out the religion. I don't think it's going very well. You have all of the rebellions, for heaven's sakes. The Messianic rebellions continue, but you have the religion, which is sort of naked because you just have the fictional character in the Gospels. And so the people who are filling in, all of the church fathers, in the third and fourth century, I think they're just patricians trying to create Christian literature, to flesh out what was in fact, a kind of stick figure. Because even though Jesus, has a kind of recorded ministry, he's really, there's not a lot of other historical documentation of the character, right? He just pops up and so I think when Augustine makes this claim, uh, I don't have any explanation for it. I think it has the effect of perhaps making Paul seem, more human, perhaps more flawed, but I don't really know. I mean, it's that once you get past the Gospels, and then you have the Flavian court recordings of the Christ, Tacitus, Dio Suetonius, like Josephus, the Flavian court historians, they all have some kind of mention of Christ, and they have some kind of mention of the messianic prophecy that foresaw the Flavian Caesar. So they're fleshing out the basic concept in the gospel to some extent, but it's just very trivial. There's some descriptions of Christianity, and Suetonius has those passages. But I think this is just they're because when you're dealing with an absence of history and you're trying to promote a religion um, as having been based on history, it isn't just the Gospels. You have to continue to produce literature to try to create the impression that there is some historical and also religious and philosophical structure to the religion. And so, I think the whole from the Gospels up to like the Nicene Creed period, I mean, that's all one process to try to create a historical backdrop that is at least plausible enough that they can try to convince people that there was this historical character and there is a historical religion, and people should pay attention to it.
I see. And I have one last easy question, and it's about the name of Yahweh. Now, when we think of Romulus, we think of him as the namesake of the Roman people. Might we also consider Yahweh as Yehu of the Yehuda, who are the Jewish people or Judean people?
Sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you. He's actually going to give us permission
No, I mean, I think
to do this.
I would just say in my opinion, it's like the strongest interpretation. Hard to prove, but man, it sure is logical.
Right. And but this is what gets me about the scholars. They can never get a consensus on whether Yahweh is just the Yehu or Yehuda people represented in such a way.
Yeah,
And
I
yet
mean, well,
I would tell anybody, if you see it that way, I think that's okay to see it that way.
of course, um, contradict it if you can. New Testament scholarship is it's not a sort of an intellectual organization that has a lot of critical thinking going on within it. I mean, the best example of this is the synoptic problem, which is just so fascinating, and they just spend endless amounts of time trying to resolve. And of course, it can never be resolved. It's unsolvable. And I would just point out that they have this idea that they have to maintain the separate identities of the authors, that they believe in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as real people. However, the fact that there are all these verbatim passages just in and of itself shows that, well, there may be independent characters, but there might not be, because there certainly are, some of the passages were written by one individual, then found their way in the other two. So my point is all you have to do to solve the synoptic problem is just take the position that there was an editorial board, that there wasn't, that the Gospels don't reflect one and only one author, that there's an editorial board that had control over them, which could make changes and additions and fiddle around with each of them. And that's what you're looking at with these verbatim passages, is just first century word processing, where they would just move passages back and forth to try to flesh these things out the way they wanted them. And so the synoptic problem is just an illusion. It's just poor thinking on the part of New Testament scholarship.
Okay, excellent. Pedanius, the Pedanius that lifts Eleazar from the field,
Yeah,
is he Pedanius Dioscorides?
it is a representation of him, certainly. But of
Right.
course, he lived earlier, and he's not a historical. It's not an appearance of Depredates on the battlefield. I think he was earlier, but he did write in his book on biology, which was, I think, the most famous book in this era. It certainly was one of them. The Romans would have all, the Roman authorship guild would have all been aware of this guy, and that and so when they have that, the passage that Pendantius comes up and takes the individual out of the ground and then holds him over to the side. I mean, this is completely impossible physically. You're obviously dealing with a metaphor of some kind here, but he's really, they're just linking to the way that Pendantius states that you have to deal with a mandrake root. That's all there is. It's just they capture the guy in the Mount of Olives. This is, if you're following along in the sequence of the events in the Gospels, this is where Jesus is at the Mount of Olives. And the individual is taken to Titus, who says he's going to be pruned. Now, this hasn't ever been, to my knowledge, kind of decoded by New Testament scholarship, and it is clearly, absolutely clearly, an oversight, a catastrophic oversight, because you have Jesus, who is being set up with these vegetative metaphors, as he's the root of David, the branch of Jesse. He's in he's on the Mount of Olives, vegetative idea.
Right,
He is
right,
in
yeah.
the Garden of Gethsemane, which is where they take grapes and press them. So it's vegetative. They're going to put a crown of thorns on his head. You're still obviously in the vegetative metaphor, and then they're going to hang him on a tree. So
right,
I would say that you really have a strong messianic vegetative metaphor. They are branching off of, to use an expression, of the messianic vegetative symbolism in the Old Testament. So now when you come to the character, to the situation in Josephus, you certainly have it on the Mount of Olives. You have this method of grabbing the individual, which is, can easily be seen as
it's like grabbing the mandrake root, right?
well, exactly. It's another vegetative metaphor. But then you have the individual taken to Titus and says he needs to be pruned. He uses
Right.
the term, the Colossae, which is a very special.
Colossae, can you spell that for me?
Kolsia. And that's could be wrong, but that's off the top of my head. And so it's my birthday today, so I can make mistakes if I choose. But anyway, it's a very important term because it's a vegetative term. It has to do with how a wild plant can be domesticated, right? And it's how you can graft on the beneficial, part of a plant and then to a wild plant. And this is the central metaphor, right, of this whole Mount of Olives things, is that the Romans are going to graft on their messianic character to the Jews' messianic literature, and then produce a domesticated Judaism.
Okay, now Colossae is Aramaic.
I think Colossae would be a Greek term.
Okay.
Hold on a second. Anyway, I'll send you a link to all this after the fact. I don't have Caesar.
I think I have enough data.
Yeah, rest assured, I think I'm right on this one. It's a Greek word, and it means pruning. So Titus is ordering the character pruned. Now, some of this is off. You have to kind of it's not in the text. You have to make logical connections. But the next time we actually come across the character, he's being crucified in a group of three. Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph Bar Matthias, asked Titus to take him down. They take the guys down, and one of them survives. Right? It's just an obvious parallel to in Josephus to the event in the Gospels of Jesus's crucifixion. Very straightforward. This is why you have in the Gospels, he's taken to Golgotha, which means empty skull, right?
Okay.
Now, in Josephus, the character is taken to Theokoa, which is a pun on Theokoos, which would mean the god of reason or of intellect.
Coius, the Titan Coius.
Right. So anyway, so this is the humor that is occurring here. They're saying, look, the Jewish Messiah, you have the empty skull. We're going to prune this character and insert, our mind uh, into this individual. And incidentally, the pruning is, I believe, well understood by Freemasonry because they have the skull and bones, which I think are representing the Eleazar's, pruning by the Roman. Hard to prove that, but at some point we can do a show on it, and I can explain, my thoughts on it if you're curious. But
That would
anyway,
be fine by
yeah.
me.
But
Yeah.
anyway. So here you have my point is getting back to kind of my disappointment with New Testament scholarship is look, you have these capturings on the Mount of Olives, and you have just obvious, um, you know, vegetative humor going on in both of them. And then following that, you have these events on which are obviously parallel crucifixion stories, right? I mean, I would say the crucifixion story in Josephus is just uncontestably the most parallel story to the Gospels in existence, right? It's just straightforward. Particularly, the name of the character takes them, begs a Roman commander. It's Joseph of Arimathea, the counselor, and Joseph Bar Matthias, who's functioning as Titus's counselor in the war. And there's only two letters are different, in this long word, Joseph Arimathea, Joseph Bar Matthias. So it's obviously a typological representation. My point is, where is the scholarship? Why hasn't the trajectory of the two Mount of Olive captures and then the two crucifixions been commented on? Because the location is the same. The vegetative symbolism is obviously in both passages, and the crucifixion story is just a spot on, dependency between the two stories. So New Testament scholarship is just asleep at the switch here. This even if I'm wrong, you have to at least do the analysis to explain so many connections between these two, very long and lengthy stories that are centerpieces inside the history of Josephus and the religious story in the Gospels.
Okay, and I just want to note that it seemed to me a little ironic that he's on the Mount of Olives and the olive branch is a symbol of peace to begin with.
Sure.
Are you saying that Roman Christianity is being grafted onto Jewish Christianity?
Yes.
That's what I thought you had said. But can't Roman Christianity be grafted directly onto Judaism?
The the Judaism. I mean, it depends what you mean by Judaism. There were different flavors of it at this point. One strand was controlled by Rome and the Herods, the Herodian Sanhedrin. They built the temple that Titus destroyed. So they had this fraction of it that was, I think, well inside of the Roman Empire. Um, but the group that rebelled, as Josephus recorded, was propelled by the understanding that the messianic prophecies foresaw a Jew. In other words, they were xenophobic. They wanted the Romans out of their area and they wanted to have their own religion. So, you just have to, try to delineate as best you can as within the literature as to which one of these flavors are being presented. But when we talk about grafting our which form of Judaism Rome was attempting to influence, it's definitely, in my opinion, the messianic militaristic version, which you can see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is what I think they were trying to effect: is the scrolls are very militaristic, they're xenophobic, they're very inspirational, I believe, in their literature to common Jews. I mean, obviously, the movement that rebelled was the national movement because they were the ones that kicked Rome out. I mean, they had to have tremendous popular support to be able to do that. They were able to set up their own nation state right inside the empire, the Roman Empire, for over 3 years. So they were a military force, and so that's the religion that Christianity, after the fact, was developed after the war to try to influence.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. I just wondered, Josephus records 1 million civilian deaths or something like that. Does archaeology really support that big of a war in Jerusalem? Uh-oh. Right. We must have had a seg in the line, or maybe I hit the wrong button. I'm
That's okay.
sorry.
But anyway, so I think that they're just trying to make a big number and record it, put it into history to frighten the Jews away from rebellion in the future.
I see.
I actually, most of the Jews who rebelled were made slaves, and Rome attempted to get use out of them. I think they were involved in building aqueducts and things like this. Well, the Colosseum. I think there's a plaque in the Colosseum indicating that the workmen um, were primarily Jewish rebels.
I
So
see.
yeah. So as far as million fatalities, I don't know. I doubt it.
Okay, in our previous conversation, we had spoken of Jesus as the Passover lamb whose bones could not be broken, and contrasted that with the broken bones of the scapegoat cast down from a mountain. Now, shouldn't we have mentioned Satan's request that Jesus cast himself down from the mountain?
Yep.
Thank you. Oh, we're
Yeah.
actually allowed to do all of this. Fascinating.
Touche. Touche. No, it's a very good point. Yeah. No. I mean, because um, so in that um, I don't know how to describe it, but in that typologic thrust, which is to say Jesus' pre-ministry, where you have what I refer to as the Moses Jesus typology, and they're
Right.
linking to to the Moses stories. They're setting Jesus up as the human Passover lamb. So he isn't, he's not going to, be a scapegoat in that sense. He's not going to have his bone broken. He's going to be eventually presented metaphorically as a human Passover lamb whose bones are not broken. Right.
Right.
This is why they make sure in the crucifixion story that we don't break his bones because he's the human Passover lamb, and they're mirroring, the story in Exodus so that Christianity can be the new covenant, right? So that's
Right.
really that simple, but that's a very, very alert spot on your part. In that vein, I'll also mention that you know um, that passage foresees the fact that Jesus is going to be the human Passover lamb. Now, there's another kind of witty moment in that period of Jesus' life where, at the very beginning, um, you know, there's no room in the inn, and so they lay him in a manger. Now, bear in mind, a manger is what animals are fed from,
Right.
right? So this is foreseeing the Last Supper. You see, believe
Yes.
me, once you get into the black comedy, there's no way that image is accidental. What
Right.
they're
Well,
doing is,
you know what? I want to know another neat thing. If you consider the zodiac as meaning what it really means, which is a circle of animals, okay, it's Jesus and the 12. And the circle of animals is the zodiac, and he is the solar hero.
interesting, yeah. So, but you can see this is when you kind of understand the point of the comedy. You can see that even though they have the classic Christmas images of the angels and Mary and Joseph and the babies in the manger, and this seems he seems so human. He's having, he's the son of God, but here he's having this really destitute situation, as an infant. But actually you look a little deeper and you can see that it's vicious mockery, because they're foreseeing that he's going to be eaten by animals at the Last Supper. In other words, so this is the symbolism leading to kind of a funny but very dark sort of comedy.
All right. And speaking of casting out, have you noticed any connection between Gerizim and the Gerasene demoniac, Gerizim being a holy mountain?
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, I don't know that about that. I've read some stuff, but I don't really have an understanding of it. So what I would hope that a lot of the interpretations I do, which are just the most obvious surface interpretations, would lead to kind of deeper understanding, because there is really a whole world of wit, of literary complexity, and it's all there, but it's just people will not, but they don't have the perspective to want to follow the literature into these kinds of meanings, because the Romans have they put a ton of that stuff in there, very very subtle, complicated connections, relating to elements in both their literature and into Jewish literature. Remember, they're trying to create a more perfect version of theologic scripture. I mean, these are very vain intellectuals who are putting the gospels together. The crew that was around the Flavian Caesars, I believe, would see themselves as the pinnacle of human intellectual power. And so when they construct their typology and their humor and put the hidden meanings into it, what they're trying to do, I think, is to basically outdo the hidden meanings that are inside the Jewish scripture. They clearly knew all of the typologic structures, all of the hidden meaning inside of the Dead Sea Scrolls and inside of the Jewish scripture, because they had so many Jews working for them. I mean, the family of the Alexanders, who were the most famous Jewish intellectual family that there was in this era, they were, had a multi-generational relationship with the Flavians. They were on the payroll. And Tiberius, who was Philo Alexander's nephew, was the Flavian general against the Jewish rebels, right? So the idea that when it comes to then the Flavians constructing the Gospels, they knew all of the deep levels of the material, and so they were able to create deep levels inside their literature too. It's but it's painstaking, and I just felt that I had enough to defend. So when I wrote Caesar's Messiah, I deliberately tried to make it, just the most overt and the easiest to understand aspect of the relationship between Josephus and the Gospels, because that would be easier and more comprehensible, you know.
Right. I agree that,
But that stuff is in there. I'm not negating it. I think that's a great, probably, that there's connections that I would love to be able, if I had another lifetime, to be able to like work through. Maybe you'll pick up the task and
okay.
get
Well,
it
I do
complete.
hope to do that in certain areas. So that is a goal of mine.
Good.
Okay, in our first interview of this series, you mentioned that you thought the Moses story came to the Jews from the Hasmoneans.
Well, it's a conjecture. I mean, I
Right.
I don't have any evidence of that. What I have is the fact that the Carthaginians were Semitic. There is a what one thing I base it on is that Josephus talks about this strange kind of intellectual relationship between the Jews and the Carthaginians. I think that they actually had some shared theology. Makes sense because they're both a Semitic people. Now the Carthaginians were evaporated. It was razed. Literature's gone, just disappeared. Romans destroyed it. So I can conjecture plausibly that when Hannibal headed towards Syria, when he tried to get out of Italy at the end of the war, he ends up above Judea. I think he might have been trying to get to Judea. It's possible because he might have seen that there would have been racial allies there for him. But in any case, as history records it, he doesn't make it. He's killed. No one really, but they don't really say what happens to his army. He obviously had forces around him. He's gone. Now it's only like 30 years later, something like that. It's a very short period of time that suddenly the Hasmoneans appear out of nowhere, and they conquer Judea. So I think it is a plausible conjecture that this is simply, either Hannibal's army itself, or is in fact somehow, that army merged with, Judean rebels that wanted to end the Hellenization of Jewish culture, which is really what the Hasmoneans, had as their calling card. And so, if that was the case, then they would have brought, their like stories into, into Judea with them. And so I think that given the, kind of African nature of a lot of the Moses, he's the Egypt stuff, and I just think that's kind of where what I think may have, and these are the oldest stories, obviously, so they would have been the ones that would have been shared if there was a kind of theologic, heritage that they shared. The oldest stories would have been the ones that would have been, held by both people. And so I think that the Hasmoneans may have been, a Moses cult, that was the descendant of the Carthaginians. Now, absent an archaeologic miracle, we will never be able to prove that. But I think it's a useful interpretive framework, and I think that, I just think that this is, can like stimulate and clarify thinking.
Okay. Didn't the Flavians launch a propaganda campaign against the Jews, including minting coins of Judea Capta, or captured Judea, whom they
Sure.
personified as a bound woman?
Yeah, and they also had, coins showing, Simon bound, before they took him to the circus.
And
And
which Simon is that, please?
this would have been the Messianic rebel Simon. But
Okay.
bear in mind, this is the basis for the character in the Gospels. If you read, James, a brother of Jesus, by Robert Eisenman, he notes that the strange parallelism. He talks about, he goes, Simon, who is taken, by Rome and executed in the Colosseum, or not the Colosseum, but in the circus that they had, for the public, executions. Um, he was the leader of a messianic movement, captured by the Romans, taken to Rome and executed. He goes, gee, this sure seems a lot like the character in the Gospels. And he said, given that they're both leaders of a messianic movement, how many such individuals could there have been? Right? He goes, this doesn't seem like it could be circumstantial. And Philip, I'll tell you, like, how did I ever get into this strange, stream of analysis? Um, I was interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They, someone who was raised a Catholic and went to Catholic, military school as a child. I'd been through the Gospels quite a few times. I thought it was an interesting idea. I'd fallen away from the faith, more or less, but no particular reason. It was just, more fun to do other things, and I was suddenly outside of, the faith. But I was interested in Jesus, and I was interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when I was reading through them, I go, gee, this is so different than the Christian congregation. They're warriors. Um, they're messianic. They use a lot of the same proof texts for the Messiah that Christianity does. And the thought occurred to me. I go, how could these two groups have gotten along side by side in such a tiny area? Right? Their stories are Judean focused, but yet there's no mention of this group in the Gospels. And the other group, the Dead Sea Scrolls, doesn't mention this pacifistic version that, of course, when were the scrolls written? I mean, but in any case, it made no sense to me that the Gospels wouldn't be aware of the organization. And I just wondered, how could they have gotten along? How could these two groups gotten along? Because it doesn't seem at its face that they could have. So that was really why I started to, to study Josephus, and, is just trying to find an answer to that really simple question of how did the two groups interact? And in fact, they didn't. That's that is the answer that I came up with.
Now, about Thecua, can you explain to us what exactly is happening in the Thecua part? Because I find the Titan Koyas, who is the Titan of asking the question, he's also called Polus,
Yeah,
a reference to the pole star, which is the center of the sky.
yeah. You have, uh, you the metaphorical language can be looked into, and real amazing concepts are revealed as you go deeper into it. Um, as I present, the parallel, the crucifixion stories, um, I just deal with the surface layer. The 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 level that I'm dealing with is the way that the typology is set up. An alert reader will simply notice that the stories are parallel. The depth that the authors have inside of the stories is not seen by even an alert reader. You have to put the kind of energy that you're doing in going into the depth.
Right.
I
Well,
just
what I'm tempted to do is to line up Sol Polis with Akoyas, the god of the question, because Sol means asked to ask or to ask for Sha'al in Hebrew.
right,
So
right.
that's what I've heard.
Oh no, I mean, I this is an absolutely coherent and I would think fascinating for people who are, so inclined, path to walk down. It makes perfect sense. I didn't do it. I didn't do that kind of analysis. In fact, whenever I was tempted to try to go to that level of depth, I would restrain myself because I just wanted to present the self-evident dependency. And so I only wanted to show the parts of the parallels, which were self-evident basically, and which would
Right.
should be noticed by a reader just as you go through the two works. You don't need to understand the depth to notice that there is a strange parallelism. And the key that I was really showing was that they're occurring in the same sequence.
Right.
That
Well, I tell you what, anybody that misses your book because they've heard bad about it, they're just cheating themselves. They need to read it for themselves and draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's held up very well. There really hasn't been any significant criticism of it. A lot of scholars have come around to being basically not necessarily accepting the whole analysis, but are studying the parallels. I mean, for example, the before Caesar's Messiah, there was virtually no analysis of like the Joseph Bar Mathia, Joseph Arimathea parallelism. But now, if you look on the internet, it's an enormous kind of genre that scholars and also the public, the scholars, I mean, sad to say, are they've been trained in the wrong direction for so long that they would really have to have an unusual or facile intellect to be able to just flip the bit and start looking at the gospels like the Caesar's Messiah analysis shows. The public, I think, has an easier time, because particularly since the sequence is something that an everyday reader can just experience, and I always point out, I go, look, a lot of the sequence are just historical things. They aren't, there's no imagination need when you read about the city of Jerusalem being encircled with a wall. I mean, that's just kind of a self-evident concept. You really can't do much with it. The temple being raised, there it is. The abomination of desolation is straightforward. The locations, the Sea of Galilee. I mean, so when when you just add to the historical events, the things which are the same thing, they're not really even kind of conceptual parallels. The parallels that other scholars have commented on, because they're so transparent, and they wondered if there was some kind of cross connection between Josephus and the writing of the Gospels. If you just take that set, it's like 15 or 20 parallels, and then notice that they're all in sequence. Well, you've proven dependency just in and of that, connection structure, and you don't need any of my like more. I decode some of the complicated parallels and things that an ordinary reader wouldn't recognize. But if you just look at the self-evident stuff and then see how many there are, and then notice it's the same sequence, I mean, you've already shown that it's dependency. And once you have dependency, once you realize that the adult ministry is dependent upon the military campaign, believe me, the rest of my analysis just becomes, I mean, incontrovertible, because these things couldn't be happen accidentally within a sequence. That isn't just not how probability operates. So once you've established dependency, I mean, I'm sad to say, in some ways, the analysis of Caesar's Messiah is just it's demonstrated. Once the reader comes to the point where they go, yep, there's enough here. The ministry of Jesus is dependent upon the military campaign. It just all falls apart. And there you have what's real, which is the Roman black humor and kind of imperial witticism, and what we thought was this story that was supposed to be an inspiration for human betterment suddenly disappears, and you see a dark face of Caesar vanity and Roman vicious humor.
Okay. Now you talk of what I think is called ate or madness as possessing the Jewish rebels. Have you ever considered the divine madness of the Bacchic Maenads as perhaps influencing this?
It's funny when you mention these concepts, I really want to talk about them because I've looked at the deep level. I have in my spare time I actually read quite a bit, and I look at this stuff, but I don't really comment on it because what I'm afraid of is that the way the critics operate is they will take the most extreme metaphorical connection that I make and then demonstrate that this is conjectural or weak, even though I usually say that that's what I'm doing. And then from that, they say, so therefore we can throw out all of the stuff. And
Right.
I'm saying, no, that isn't a coherent method of criticism. You've got to build out from what is agreed upon. I mean, so the first thing is, well, what can we agree upon? Can we agree upon that the encircling of Jerusalem with a wall that is in the Gospels and Jesus predicts is in fact the event that Josephus records? And can we agree upon that? And then you work out from that to the point where you've established dependency. But for me, of all people, to go into the more interesting areas, because really, let's face it, Philip, we're kind of like literary people, and we love this sort of stuff.
Right.
But I have to restrain myself because I know if I do, this will be another example of parallel mania.
Right. No, no, I agree. You're wise to cut off the threads.
Not to say I don't intuit them and also see them, and also would love to see more analysis, because this really is in my opinion, what we should be doing. I mean, this is a great kind of new kind of curriculum that has to be developed. Is the deeper level, and I'm hoping to see it make some progress in this area within my lifetime.
Right. Well, Dionysus gets King Pentheus killed by his own mother, who is agave, and agave is a dragon plant, much as I have conjectured that the mandrake is.
Yeah, I mean, perfectly coherent.
It's what you make tequila out of. It's the agave. It's really wicked looking Dracaena. Okay, that's the family it comes from, the Dracaena, and it means Draco, dragon.
That's interesting, particularly interesting to me because I'm into tequila and have been to.
Is that right? Okay, I didn't know.
I've been to like tequila manufacturing, um, vineyards. I guess would be.
You drink the good stuff then.
Try to, but in a pinch, we'll go with what's available. I like tequila. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Now, we haven't talked about Chorazin, and there are allegories like a fish and smoked fish and a tower where they smoke fish, or am I even right? I mean, I don't
No,
know.
you're absolutely right. I go into it and like the Chorazin is like a Jesus says, woe to you, Chorazines, and he's talking about the inhabitants of a village on the Sea of Galilee. This is a village that was in the zone that was the rebellion was being fomented in, and so he goes, "Woe to you!" And I say, look, this is very likely a pun on the fishing for men metaphor,
Right.
right?
And preservation, the smoking is preservation, and Jesus is a savior, so he's a preserver.
Well, he certainly is. Um,
Okay.
so you have all of these fishing, metaphor, or not necessarily metaphor, but historical kind of connections to fishing that Josephus is recording as the military campaigns heads toward the Sea of Galilee. And and I think that they are certainly, you know, they are the flavor of the kind of, to use an expression, of the fishing for men, um, metaphor in the Gospels.
Is
And
oh, I'm sorry.
no,
Is
no,
there a
no,
crucifixion there at Chorazin? I know different Jesuses are crucified in,
not that I'm aware of.
but
No.
there is one at Thekla. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
like Tekoa, I don't know if that's actually a real place, or could be, but I think that as it's used in Josephus, it's just metaphorical. They're just relating to the grafted Jesus will have the mind that the Romans give him, basically, and not this empty skull, this idiot that the Jewish Messiah is being represented as. So um, this is Rome. It's Roman metaphor, and it's obviously easy to contest. Notice that when you get into any kind of metaphorical interpretation, it's easy to say, nah, it's could be yes, could be no, this is not strong. It's really, the structure depends upon the acceptance of the dependency and of sequence. Once you have that, you have a platform from which you can coherently analyze yes or no these metaphors. And so when you look at the the language that is being expressed in the Gospels about fishing, it's it's it is it is very easy to understand that this is based upon Titus's catching the Jewish rebels like fish in the Sea of Galilee. Jesus envisions that his disciples will, uh, catch men like fish in the future. Titus, at the same location, has his followers actually catch men like fish. Um,
Right.
so this is, you know, even here you can say, well, yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. It's metaphorical. You're this is could be parallel mania. There's no one is recording these facts. You're interpreting. But one thing you're not interpreting is location and sequence. Those are facts that are inside the literature, and in both stories, in Josephus and the Gospels, you have location, and you have mechanical description of fishing for men in both cases. So um, could be metaphorical, but once the sequence is established, and once you realize that this is simply the beginning of it, and then you see it connects to all of the other events, then you would say, well, if you accept the sequence, then excuse me, then you have to accept the metaphorical connection, because it is within the sequence, and that this kind of metaphorical parallelism wouldn't happen accidentally, because that would be what you would be arguing, is that, yeah, we accept the sequence, all of this other stuff is related, but here, even though the metaphor is clear enough that an alert reader could see it, it occurs accidentally. You see what I mean? Once
Right.
the sequence is established, the accidental explanation of the parallels that are occurring within the sequence, which are a little too metaphorical to just be self-evident. But once you've established the sequence, you then have the onus on the person who is trying to negate the connection, that this was accidental, and that's, believe me, is a losing proposition, because sequence is like the strongest basis for dependency that you can have in literature.
Okay. I think you also discuss a place that is called Onion or Onius.
Oh, yeah, that's in there. Um, I don't even recall what I'd have to look.
That's
Uh,
okay. Just don't
for
worry
it.
about it. It's a
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a
yeah.
big book. So
Yeah, well,
I
the thing is, yeah, I mean, again, now I can recall it, but I'm very tempted to go into. In fact, sometime it would be fun to actually have a discussion which would not be about Caesar's Messiah, but just about your understanding of the metaphors.
Right.
I
Well,
would be.
I would want to talk about
I would love.
coitus.
I would love to be in that conversation. I would
Okay.
love to be in that conversation, but um, I just can't at this point. Um, it's awkward for me to do it. So
Right. No, no, that's fine. Can we see Jesus's body as a metaphor for the Jerusalem temple that is destroyed by Titus?
sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
And
Can you just give me 30 seconds?
yeah, yeah, go.
Philip, I'm back. I'm sorry to have gone. What happens is I live in a private lane, and the
Okay.
utility companies are shutting down the lane.
All right.
Um, there's some kind of electrical problem, and they're going to have to shut the lane down. These conversations, I hope that the listeners get as much value out of them as I experience. And so let's try to do this again as soon as you can. All right.
All right. Thank you, sir. I will
Thank you.
contact
Thank you,
you.
brother. I got to go move my car so I don't get trapped in here and end up starving to death.
Have a good day, Joe.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye. And please subscribe to Magic Jesus. youtube.com/@magicjesus.